test cheap versus expensive garden hose. And cheap one, very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive football boots. An expensive one, very cool.
Let's test cheap versus expensive medium pile paint rollers. Starting with a roll test, cheap seems to be more consistent. Moving on to a paint saturation test, and again cheap seems to hold on to more paint. This correlates with a final test where cheap seems to give off more splashes than drips, but overall cheap wins. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive chocolate cereal. An expensive one, very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive gloves. Expensive starts off strong, doing better in the strength test. This is in contrast to the oiled watermelon test where cheap performs better. And finally on the longevity test, this time again expensive does better. Based on merit, expensive wins. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive football gloves. Starting with a watermelon pickup test, this time cheap does better. Onto our bodyweight grip hang test, and we can see that cheap moves around a bit more than expensive. Both perform well on a medicine ball drop test. On our breathability test, we can see that cheap does a much better job. And this follows on with our dexterity test where again cheap does better. And finally confirming cheap has a higher surface grip, so cheap wins. Very cool.